Welcome to this installment in our series of 4 conversations with archaeologist Jeremy L. Nienow. This series is sponsored by the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative and focuses on archaeological work undertaken in 3 of the collaborative's Minnesota counties, Dakota, Ramsey, and Scott. This work was conducted by Principal Investigator Nienow along with his firm, Nienow Cultural Consultants. My name is Barry Madore. I had the honor of hosting these conversations with Jeremy. Our first conversation was an overview of the project as a whole. The other 3 focus on the work accomplished in each specific county. Our conversations were held virtually with only our voices being recorded. So what you'll be watching is not so much a video of us talking, but more of a presentation. While we talk, you'll see photos, maps, and documents highlighting both the archaeological work itself and the historical research Nienow completed during the project, which began in 2019 and wrapped up in the spring of 2020. Before we begin, you should know that this project was funded in part by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund with a Heritage Partnership Program grant administered by the Minnesota Historical Society and awarded to the Dakota County Historical Society in partnership with the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative. Enjoy the presentation. So Jeremy, why don't you introduce yourself and the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative?
Hi, thanks a lot for having me here. My name is Jeremy Nienow. I'm an archaeologist working in the upper Midwest, primarily in Minnesota, doing both prehistoric and historic archaeology. I've been in the archaeology community since 1993 when I started getting my undergraduate at UW-La Crosse. I then got a master's degree at the College of William and Mary right around 1999-2000. And then came back to the Twin Cities in early 2000s to get my PhD from the University of Minnesota, also in anthropology. I've always been in and around and surrounded by archaeology my entire career, whether I was teaching classes for a variety of different institutions here in the Metro or doing cultural resource management, which is really business archaeology or the archaeology of the everyday, where people are not primarily doing research work archaeology like you might see in the movies with large excavations, but instead they're out doing archaeology as it relates to development and business and historical projects. And that's really what we're talking about today. We've got an interesting project that is a mix of both research that these several counties wanted to do, but also has a business component in the sense that this kind of archaeology helps us to understand areas that have been developed or will be developed in the future and provide that information back not only to the archaeological community, who's always interested in it, but also to the public at large.
I take it then, Jeremy, that your work in cultural resource management and your interest in historical projects brought you into contact with the collaborative. How did that relationship come about?
So the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative was the brainchild of Chad Roberts, the executive director of the Ramsey County Historical Society. Back in 2015, he decided to work with 3 other counties besides Ramsey County, the Anoka County Historical Society, Dakota County, and Scott County, to develop this collaborative with the idea of if you have a partnership between the 4 of them, they can hire one archaeologist or one archaeological company to do a whole series of projects that template across each of the counties. And that way they don't each have to hire their own archaeologist and try to figure out different contracts, how to do things differently and uniquely in each county. You get one archaeologist to do things across all the counties. It makes it a lot easier, more effective, both financially and time-wise, logistically. So they applied to the Minnesota Legacy Amendment, which is a constitutional amendment that we added about a decade ago now to fund cultural arts and heritage projects. It's managed by the Minnesota Historical Society. Each of these county historical societies wanted to have a much better handle about what kind of archaeology had already been done in their county, what kind of archaeology was present in their museum, that each of them have their own museum, and then could we do some kinds of archaeology with the public in mind as part of that project? So there was really these 3 different prongs, and I was hired to do that work. Really, I was just getting going at that point, and this was a perfect jumping off spot for me because I had both a good understanding of the archaeology of the state. I was starting to do archaeology full-time out in the field, and I was very public-oriented because I've been doing an awful lot of teaching and we got the grant. And in that first series, what we found is that each of the different historical societies had various different understandings of the materials that they had in their own collections, as well as what kind of archaeology had already been done in their county. So that was the first project. And at the end of that, they decided that this was really successful and they wanted to do another one. And so they focused on alpha sites, which are non-officially recorded sort of site prospects, if you will, in each county. So they applied for a second round of funding and they received that. And they ultimately hired Blondo Consulting to do that work. That was a few years ago. And then after that step was completed, they realized that each of the counties had a wide variety of these alpha sites. Some of them are historic in terms of like old ghost towns or mills, but also a lot of prehistoric sites, mound groups. The project had some limited success that second run, but they realized that they needed a lot more time to be able to successfully go after that. So in the third round, they decided to specifically focus on identifying at least 2 different site locations for work in each of the 3 counties at this point that were participating, with a focus on alpha sites where possible. Not only were there reports that had to be done with that, but we had to have public insight from the very beginning, presentations before we got started, public involved with the field work as we got going, and then at the end with the results, presentations afterwards. And that's actually what we're doing here today. We're working on one of those very same presentations because we can't do presentations in person anymore currently because of the COVID pandemic.
So choosing the sites for investigation in this third round, was that done during the previous rounds, or was it part of the process at the beginning of the third iteration?
That's a good question. So we did take the initial information that Blondo Consulting had compiled, and then we made a decision tree about which sites could be of most interest to go after. Sometimes in archaeology, you might be dealing with a rather large area that the alpha site could be in, because they might have just did an entire quarter section. Somewhere out here is a mill site. It's in this quarter section. We see it on the Andreas Atlas in 1874. It's out there someplace we don't really know where it is. And nowadays, since 1874, that 1 quarter section of land now might have a dozen landowners on it. So that would be quite challenging to try to go out to a project where there's 12 different landowners and try to get permission from each of them to go out onto their property to do this work. So sites that had a lot of modern property owners, we put down to the lower end of the hierarchy. And then each county themselves had their own ideas over what kinds of projects we should tackle. So I'll give a couple of examples of that. In Scott County, there has been a lot of work, investigational work, in the northern part of Scott County, near where the city of Shakopee is today. As you go farther down in the county, even though there may be potential for more sites in cultivated areas, they haven't been examined yet because there hasn't been a lot of development, or there just hasn't been a lot of interest. And so the executive director at Scott County said, let's focus on the lower half of the county. And as part of that process, and as we started talking with local stakeholders in the project, she reached out to the local Native American community, and they were just starting to do some of their own interesting work and suggested that we focus more on historic sites versus Native American sites for this project.
Can you give me a definition, prehistoric, historic, especially in relationship to Native communities?
Sure. So, historic archaeology is anything from Christopher Columbus, 1492 and forward.
Okay.
So anything that we have an historic document or record for. It's not to say that Native peoples are inferior, savage, less intelligent, or anything like that. They just did not record their histories in the same way that Euro-Americans did. They have oral traditions that carry stories forward, or as you move farther south into South America, they had strings of knots and things that would help them key to their mind to oral history stories. So prehistory is everything before Euro-American contact, typically understood as 1500 and earlier, and historic archaeology is 1500 and forward.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that.
But there's a tremendous overlap,
Right.
because here in Minnesota, we don't have contact between Euro-Americans and Native Americans until the late 1600s, when we have the first missionaries and fur traders coming in. So you have Nicolay and all the Radisson and all the famous stories of French fur traders and other.
So does that definition shift from place to place based on when you have historical record? You're just talking about, bam, somebody was doing something on paper here, so that's historic record. Okay.
Right. No. So what we do is we tend to call that period the contact period. So prehistoric archaeology in Minnesota really should go until the 1600s. And then we have a contact period when they're coming in contact with Euro-Americans. And then after that, it becomes the historic period. Once Native peoples start adopting Euro-American ways of life, either through choice or through force, that's basically the material culture type shifts to the historic period.
Okay, thank you. So getting back to what we were talking about, the Native communities in Scott County asked you to focus on historic sites rather than Native sites.
Right. And Scott County agreed and said, hey, why don't you find 2 historic sites that have an interesting story behind them that are in the second lower half of the county. So that was our focus for that. So we looked at a series of different sites, and 2 sites there really caught our eye. And it's the story of Helena, both Helena, Old Helena, and New Helena. Old Helena was a ghost town that got started in the 1850s that we'll talk a little bit about. And it was a thriving community for about a dozen years and then started to wane. And then when the railroad came in the 1870s, they moved the post office to a second location. So essentially they moved the town over to another location, and that community got going in the 1870s and was really thriving all the way through World War I. And then essentially it was dissolved and the people moved away to nearer communities in the more northern part of Scott County. So it's a doubly abandoned ghost town in 2 different locations, both in Helena Township and Scott County. And it's a very interesting place. And you'll find out more about that project when we have a separate presentation on the archaeology of Scott County.
Great.
So Scott County, big focus on historic components. And even though we wanted to find both prehistoric and historic components in each county, sometimes we were forced to make a choice. Interestingly enough, as a side tangent on Helena 1 or Old Helena, in doing the work there, the landowner actually had found some Native American projectile points in his yard, and we documented those. So there was both a prehistoric already existing component as well as the ghost town. So we got both prehistoric and historic at that site, which was interesting. In Ramsey County, it was a little bit different. We had already done some archaeology work along Fish Creek, which is a creek that connects Carver Lake down into the Mississippi River in the sort of southern Maplewood. And some archaeology work had been done there in the last 20 years. Some of the work had actually been done at the very beginning of the metro area project back in 2015 to re-examine an archaeological site that had been found during development. Ultimately, that development didn't happen, and the land was later purchased publicly as part of a joint program with Ramsey County and Maplewood. Since that time, they developed it into a park. And as the development for that park progresses and as they start thinking about places to put trails and interpretation, we've been doing some archaeology ahead of that work, as part of this development piece that CRM archaeologists or cultural resource management archaeologists are all about. That was the first of the 2 sites for Ramsey County. The other one was the well-known and investigated Gibbs Farm. The Gibbs Farm is an mid-1800s frontier house. The Gibbs originally with a sod house and then still standing farmhouse there now, and then other properties have been moved in for the Ramsey County Historical Society, including a schoolhouse. It's immediately north of the University of Minnesota St. Paul campus. And the site has been archaeologically examined a few times over the years, especially the sod house, but they are in the process of developing another portion of the property, and so they decided to have us do archaeology ahead of that by doing shovel testing and basically putting in holes about the size of a toilet seat and going down a couple of feet to see what kinds of materials are there. So for Ramsey County, more known area, but still interesting places for excavation. And in Scott County, a real focus on historic. Dakota County, we were able to do exactly what we set out to do, both prehistoric and historic sites that were generated by picking the low-hanging fruit and finding sites that had good coverage, lots of availability for public to go out on them, and actually plowed fields to walk, and interesting both prehistoric and historic sites to examine. And we'll talk about both of those for Ramsey County and Dakota County coming up in the other presentations.
Great. Speaking of, in preparation for those, could we lay out a little bit more context? Could you talk about how you proceeded once sites were selected for investigation and give us a little overview of what you found?
Sure. So as we were going through the project, all 3 of the counties, we started with We started first with presentations in each county, and we got really good public reception. We had individuals coming up at the talk saying, "Hey, have you thought about going to this side?" And, "Oh, my grandmother lived at Helena, and here's information about this." And, "Oh, I have some audio recordings." I mean, just all kinds of stuff just come out of the woodwork. You never know what you're going to get, and that's what's really exciting. But as we were doing the projects, yes, we did find and identify archaeological sites, but there wasn't a huge amount of artifact materials. Native American sites have been around for thousands of years, and there isn't a lot of material that survives over a couple thousand years of use. Usually we get lithic material, chipping debris from making stone tools, and then ceramics. After a couple thousand years and people start making ceramics, we start seeing fragments of those left in the landscape. But we don't see a lot of the other organic materials of everyday life, clothing and diet and things like that are really hard to capture. So we just didn't find a lot of archaeological materials while we were doing the work. And one part of this grant was to do artifact analysis across all of the counties and across both the historic and prehistoric sites. So we kind of ran into a conundrum where we didn't have enough materials where we really felt that we could do some kind of analysis justice. So we went back to each of the county historical societies and we said, do you have collections that are available at your historical societies that we could use that maybe no one has done any research on? They've been donated by members of the public. And if you haven't done that work yet, we can include this, because essentially those are alpha sites at this point. They're unknown, undocumented collections. So let's think about those. Each county had things like that in its collections or that were going to end up in their collections. So Scott County has the fewest things. They have like less than a dozen Native American materials in their entire collection. And one of the more well-known collectors in their community by the name of Norb had just died, and his wife was in the process of documenting his collection and trying to figure out what to do with it. So we reached out to her, and I really wanted to go and photo document that collection and then do some research on it. And unfortunately, right when we got that process started, COVID-19 came in and we were not able to go and look at that collection. Unfortunately, she's a quite older lady and we really didn't want to put her at risk for the project.
Right.
I really hope in the future that we have the opportunity to do that. But for Ramsey County, they had access to a couple of collections of either recently excavated materials or materials that they've had in their collections that hasn't had a lot of research done on it. So one of those collections for them was the Lafayette Park collection. The Lafayette Park was here in St. Paul area, and it was originally established in the 1860s. And then afterwards, that area went from upper class to lower class over time. Sadly, in the 20th century, Lafayette Park became Lafayette paved parking area and stopped being a park. But there were archaeology materials that were recovered in the 1940s, and those materials were given to Ramsey County Historical Society. There's been some attempts over the years by undergraduates to take a look at this collection, but no one had ever done a comparative collection with other places. Also in Ramsey County, recently there have been excavations done by Historic St. Paul on the 412 Goodrich property. They excavated a privy in the backyard area. That was also done by Nienow Cultural Consultants, luckily, so I was pretty familiar with the project. The house itself was built in the 1850s, but the privy materials really started in the early 1880s and then went until the 1940s, late 1940s, early 1950s. And there was a small component of historic ceramic materials for that collection, so we incorporated those. And then we also included materials from Dakota County, including the Hogan family homestead collection. The Hogan family established a farmstead down near Burnsville in 1855, and so we were able to incorporate those materials. I don't know if it was a member of the family or just an historical interested person, collected a whole bunch of things from the dump, the family dump, and gave those all to the Dakota County Historical Society, kind of in bags given. And so we did some rough sorting of those and then started to do some basic analysis. And then for Scott County itself, we used a small assemblage of ceramic materials from Old Helena. So Old Helena, or Helena 1, got set up in the 1850s as well. So it's comparative with the Hogan family farmstead. And we used ceramics from each of those different sites to look at not only status issues, but also ethnicity, and to see which of these were the most costly and therefore showed the most status. So that's what we did for the historic archaeology. We did a ceramics assemblage using collections across each of the counties from each of them. For prehistoric archaeology, same sort of thing. We didn't have a lot of materials. So what we did for prehistoric archaeology is we knew that the Dakota County Historical Society has the largest prehistoric assemblage, I would say, of outside of the University of Minnesota, any county historical society in Minnesota. I think they have between 60 and 100,000 objects. Fred Lashy, a founder of the Dakota County Historical Society, was an avid collector himself, amateur archaeologist as well as historian. He went out and collected on sites all over the upper Midwest, including South Dakota and Minnesota and Wisconsin. So there's a huge assemblage. So we did something very similar in that we used primarily the collections from the Dakota County Historical Society to look at a whole set of materials, both from Dakota County. We tried to get the materials from Scott County, but unfortunately with Norb's wife, with COVID, we weren't able to do that one. But we were also able to get a small collection of 20-some objects from a family that actually settled in part of the Fish Creek Project area, the Lido family. They had a small family collection of things that they had found over the years on their own land, and we used that also as part of that comparative collection. So for each of these projects, although we weren't able to initially use materials that we had just found as part of the project, we were able to go back to existing collections that had been underutilized for decades, if not from the very beginning of the starts of some of these historical societies, and get some brand new information and data and really start to document these collections. And that, at least in the case of Dakota County, it's going to springboard them to hopefully their next grant round, which is really to think about what are the archaeological materials in their collection, how do they best care for those things, and how do they actually start doing analysis on them.
Were there any cross-county discoveries or theories that you developed during the analysis?
So for the historic collection, let's talk a little bit more in detail about the ceramics analysis that was done. And this work was done by Fred Sutherland of Sutherland Relics and Rust. He's an historical and industrial archaeologist here in the Twin Cities who has a really strong focus on early 1800s through the modern day. First of all, the collections were analyzed, cataloged, and instead of thinking about the raw number of individual objects for ceramics, you look at them as minimum vessels. So there might be 30 pieces that comprise that one vessel, and there might be only one piece that comprises a vessel, but they all, by vessel, get described, and the analysis is done on them. So for the Hogan family collection, there were 44 vessels. For the 412 project, there were 14 vessels. The Lafayette Park collection had 23 vessels, and the Helena collection has 26 vessels. So that was a large enough comparative sample size for us to be able to do some meaningful work. Of these collections, we have different ethnic backgrounds. So the Hogan family is Irish. The 412 Goodrich family, the Walla family that was primarily there during the period of the archaeology was done, is a Bohemian family. In Lafayette Park, you have individuals from a variety of different backgrounds, but primarily from a higher social economic background. And then in the Helena area down in southern Scott County, you have primarily a German background group. So we have a variety of different backgrounds. Everyone has a set of everyday ceramics that they use. Planar wares tend to be white wares or ironstones, which are a little bit thicker vessels. And then they have sets of materials that are not for the everyday, that are things that you want to use for entertaining, maybe for display purposes.
The fine china. The
fine china, exactly right. So porcelains, chinas, decorative stuff, regardless of where you were at. And these collections stretch from the 1850s and 60s all the way into the 1940s. Regardless of who you are and where you come from, you have a set of everyday working materials that everyone has. And then you also have the fine china stuff that you put out for display. And we have a variety of that from each of these assemblages. That's a similarity across all of them. We thought early on with our hypothesis, well, there's a no-brainer. Lafayette Park is a high-end part of St. Paul when it got started in the 1860s. This would be the place where you get your high-end ceramics from. And, you know, people that are living on a farmstead in Helena or a farmstead in Burnsville or something like that in the 1860s, they're really going to have lower end stuff, and we're going to see a lot of everyday things there. So that's sort of our starting hypothesis was there. And what we found was kind of the exact opposite of everything we thought we were going to find for our analysis. So what we saw was, yes, we had some higher end ceramics at each of the locations, but we also had a lot of low end materials at them But the nicer low-end stuff was actually for the farmsteads and the small communities. So the Hogan family has some of the nicest ironstone materials for its time period in the 1860s of any of the collections, which is great. And then Lafayette falls below that. So we don't know where these things were collected in Lafayette Park. It could be very well that these ceramics were actually from the park itself, which means people are bringing out things for a Sunday picnic, and they're not bringing their high-end china when they go out for a nice Sunday picnic.
Right.
So that was a really nice, successful part of the project. Not only were we able to get ceramic collections from each of the different counties, and even though we weren't able to get them directly from, in some cases, our own public excavations that we had done as part of this project, we were able to bring in collections that either hadn't been examined before or had just been done by other projects and look at them from a different angle. It was a win on multiple levels.
Right.
We had very similar interesting results also with the prehistoric collections. Essentially, we had one small collection from Ramsey County that had 21 objects, but then we had a much larger set of collection materials from Dakota County. We went to the Dakota County Historical Society. We looked for materials that Fred Lasche had pulled that had Native American projectile points and arrowheads. They were all generically called arrowheads, even though, as we'll talk about here in a little bit, a lot of these things were not from an arrow in any way, shape, or form. They're way too big and they're way too old before people have that access to bow and arrow technology. There were 125 different lithic objects that were studied as part of this entire assemblage. So 21 from the small collection in Ramsey County, and then the remainder of that collection, 104 objects, were all from those two collections in Dakota County that were both put in by Fred Lasche. A small subset of that collection, of Lasche's collection, actually comes from what he called Caposia Village, which at that time was right along the road coming into South St. Paul. And Caposia Village has an interesting story that's, at least in the historic record, is about 50 years of time frame, even though we know people were living here much earlier than that. It's first documented in 1805 by Zebulon Pike. It's a Metawakan village that is at that time is on the east side, just about where St. Paul is now today. And it's got a whole series of about a dozen family structures that are there that Zebulon finds. And he actually holds a meeting with a series of chiefs from the area, including the chief of the village, Little Crow. And that's the first time it gets mentioned. And then over the next 50 years, as people start to come in and as other military expeditions come through and then ultimately Euro-American settlement starts to happen, we see this village mentioned time and again, and it's in different locations. Over time, it moves. You get tired of living in one place. You might have a lot of bathroom areas, or you've denuded the landscape and you've used a lot of the resources, and so you pick up your village and you move to the next spot. So the last time that we see mention of Little Crow's village, it's in 1851. Little Crow 5 is now the chief at Caposia, and there's 300 inhabitants that live there. They've adopted a lot of Euro-American techniques and things for life and living. So they're doing plowing and lots of agriculture. They've constructed Native American houses and storehouses and have harvested almost 5,000 bushels of corn. Right at that point, the Treaty of Mendota happens in 1851, and they are actually removed and put on a reservational area at the Lower Sioux Agency, and they remain there until the U.S.-Dakota Wars after that. So we know that this Caposia village moved along both sides, the east and west sides of the Mississippi River, from about where St. Paul proper is today, all the way down through to where the stockyards are at in South St. Paul. Fred Lasche collected a whole series of Native American materials from an area that he called Caposia. And so we had two primary research questions for dealing with this project. One is we wanted to know what was the general time periods, where did the raw materials come from? So what do we know about these assemblages, these two different assemblages? And then the second question was the materials that Fred Lasche collected, are these actually from Caposia Village? The village itself, if you want to think of it as an historic village that's at least 1805 to 1851, are these the kinds of materials we'd expect to find in a village at that time period? So we had Alexandra Hedquist of Hedquist Archaeological Consulting did the work for this. She's a recent graduate of St. Cloud State and has focused her archaeological career in prehistoric archaeology, where Fred has focused his in historical archaeology. So she did the comparative work, and we initially wanted to do a lot of comparative analysis using the Minnesota Historical Society collections there's a really vast lithic comparative collection that's housed across from the big history center at the Kellogg property right across the street. So we just started doing that work. Alex and I started doing that work, and then COVID happened and we couldn't go in the building anymore. And so we had to rely on a lot of other digital databases in order to do that work. So there's 125 objects in these collections that they looked at, and they cover a really wide range of time periods. One of the things that we know about Native American culture, Native American life, is that people have been living in the upper Midwest area for at least 13,000 years. Earliest peoples are nomadics, moving across the landscape, harvesting things as they travel around season to season, and that over time, as populations increase and resource sharing and use changes, their ways of life change. So these nomadic early groups are using Atlatl and dart technology. They're making large spear points or arrow dart points. So that's 13,000 years ago. By 2,000 years ago, Native Americans are now using bow and arrow technology. They're making ceramic vessels. They're burying their dead in large mound groups, which we see thousands of these on the landscape still in Minnesota today. And then by the time we start seeing Euro-American contact with them in the late 1600s all the way through the 1800s, they have large palisaded villages on the landscape, and they're readily adapting all kinds of different cultural things, and they easily and quickly bring in Euro-American trade goods as well and start incorporating those in their culture. So, but the things that we find the most in the landscape are these projectile points from various time periods. So the oldest projectile points are the largest and the most beautifully made, and over time, the projectile points get smaller and smaller as they move from spear points to Atlatl dart points to bow and arrow arrowheads.
When you say Atlatl, is that how you pronounce it?
It's the best Scrabble word ever. ATL, ATL. You got all those junk letters. Make use of it.
Are these sort of the sling projectiles?
Yeah, so an Atlatl itself is about 2 to 2.5 feet long, and it's basically a way to extend the length of your arm. So there's just some physics going on there, some basic physics in the use of levers and things. If you made your arm even longer, with little efficient movements of your wrist, you can throw things much farther. So the perfect example of an Atlatl today are, for all of our dog owners out there, they have these little ball pitcher things. It's about 2 feet long. It's made out of plastic. It's got a little scoop at the end. Right. And all you do is you flick your wrist and that tennis ball goes flying. So that's an Atlatl. The dart was 4 to 5 feet long and fletched at one end, and then has the projectile point at the other end. And you can basically loft these things with good velocity and good distance. At this time, people are hunting megafauna and other large things in the landscape. A lot of people think that bow and arrow technology is superior for hunting versus Atlatl, and it's actually the opposite. Atlatl is way easier to do than bow and arrow, but bows and arrows are really good for warfare. So the reason people are jumping to bow and arrow technology is we have a large increase on population over time. People start to fight over scarcer and scarcer resources. And so when we see warfare coming in, you see the use of bow and arrow.
So you're able to tell the history or the dates for these objects based on the size of the spear points?
Right. So not only their size, but how well they're made.
Okay.
Over time, projectile points, as they get smaller with the different technology, they also tend to get a little bit cruder made. It's not that people are forgetting how to make things. They're just making them faster and more of them, and they're using local materials more and more. Till the very end, the very small arrow points or bird points are only, 3/4 of an inch in size versus 10 inches in size.
Oh, wow.
And they only have to be very small on the end of an arrow to do its job.
Right.
So we wanted to look at not only where the raw materials themselves come from, but then over time, what's the oldest projectile points we find, and then what's these newer ones, and does this make sense for Caposia? We found some similarities, of course, and some differences. And the similarities one was that we have the entire range of time periods represented in these collections.
Right.
What we also found is that our raw materials came from all over the upper Midwest. So looking at these collections, you can start to think about trade. Initially, people are actually moving around the landscape, and then over time, as you become more sedentary and you're hanging out in your village more, you're actually trading these goods with over the vast highways that are the waterway systems, and you're getting access to these materials all over the upper Midwest. So not only were we able to catalog all of that, but we're also able to photo document those in a way that had never been done before. In the MAHSC collection as it exists, there's a piece of paper, typewritten pieces of paper for each of these, and it says, where did it come from? What's its provenience? Who found it? A little bit of description, and then there's a little space to draw the outline of the object. That's all there is, and that's the catalog for those objects.
Okay.
So we've been able to, move it into Excel, and we took photographs of each side of each projectile point. So the dorsal side, the ventral side, and the profile, and then we merged together all three of those to create these beautiful composite images for all the 100+ objects in both those collections.
Oh, wow.
So we did that. We were also able to answer that question about, did these things really come from Caposia? And the answer is probably not. They probably didn't come from the actual village of Caposia as we understood it from 1805 to 1851, because our projectile points, some of the projectile points are 8,000 years old.
Right.
So that's not happening. So there's two hypotheses that come out of this. One, they're not from that area and that they've been mislabeled or misprovenienced. Or second hypothesis is that people have been living along the Mississippi River for 8,000 years.
For that long.
Yep. And that the same places that you and I want to live, nearby water, on high points of land, with access to good resources and transportation, are exactly the same places that people wanted to live in the past. So when I'm out on a project and the landowner will come, or a local farmer, and he's like, what are you doing? I'm looking for archaeological sites. Well, how do you know where they're at? And I'm like, well, would you like to build a house here? And he goes, yeah, I've always wanted to build a house here. It's like, great. That's probably where the archaeological site is, right where you want to build your house. So what that means is, for me as an archaeologist, is oftentimes when people are doing new developments and they happen to need to have an archaeologist, either because they're getting federal funding for their project in some way, or maybe they need to get a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers, they have to do an environmental assessment. The chances are they're going to need an archaeologist, because if you want to build something on that place and you think it's a really good place to do it, somebody already thought of that 8,000 years ago, and they've been hanging out there ever since.
Yeah.
To finish up what we were talking about with the prehistoric collection, once we did that work with the two collections from Dakota County, Alex looked at the small prehistoric collection from the Lido collection from Fish Creek. And unlike the other collections, which had just been picked up or donated in lots of, myriad different settings, this collection is very narrow. So it's got a very few number of raw materials. They're almost all local or with a southeastern Minnesota bent. And they all tend to be from the same time period in the early to middle woodland. And those also help to tell you that these are probably collected from one archaeological site that's from one moment in time. It just happens to be 800 years ago. And that's a real difference between this collection and the overall larger assemblage that Fred Lashy did.
Right.
Interestingly enough, we went back as part of our work with the Fish Creek and did excavations in the very same areas where these materials were collected. We put in 20 shovel tests, and one day it was getting hot out. Everyone was uncomfortable, but we were very excited about doing archaeology, and we didn't find anything else, which is unfortunate in the sense that we want to find more things, but it also means that we can go back and start putting in trails in some of these places, and we know that we're not impacting
That can be disturbing.
Resources, which is really a benefit. So not only were we able to do a lot for Dakota County in terms of helping to better catalog and better document, photo document for sure, their collections, we were then able to take one snapshot in time, the Lido collection from Ramsey County, and place it against and juxtapose it against the Dakota County collection.
So it sounds like having you working with collections across the counties, in working with other archaeologists and other cultural consultants, I'm hearing in our conversation that these collections are talking to each other. And part of the reason that that can happen is because you were there to make those connections and switch up what you were doing. So it sounds to me like you're answering that question about how effective is this model of one archaeologist working in multiple counties, as opposed to different projects happening and then somebody coming along later and trying to make some of those connections. How effective do you think this model has been? And do you think it's something that will be explored in the future?
I really hope that other people take on this model, because really since 2015, first working with all 4 counties, and then over the years, both myself and Stephen Blano from Blano Consulting working on the second round with 3 different counties, it's been highly effective to have one person look at all the things across the counties and then immediately see those connections and then put them together for the public. And I can't say that this is a brand new thing, because ever since the Legacy Amendment got put into place, and really beginning in the 1970s, the Minnesota Historical Society has been engaging in something called the Statewide Archaeological Survey. They periodically would look at the archaeology of one county, and they would try to get archaeologists to do as much work as they can in that one county for a year. Each year that the Legacy Amendment's been around, the Minnesota Historical Society has gotten a separate pool of money, and each year they put out 2 of these legacy grants to do major projects in the state. And at least one out of each of those every year is another county survey. So MHS sees the value in this. All we did is that we spread it out into a series of counties at one time to make it more effective and sort of doing it on a smaller scale. The more work that we do in a partner setting, not only do they start talking to each other about the kinds of different collections that they have, but then they can start talking about loaning those collections to different places, or maybe even having them given back to the places from whence they came originally, because archaeologists were moving around the landscape and collectors were finding things wherever they could. So it really creates a whole series of connections that happen year after year, and that benefits everybody. So not only does it benefit the historical societies themselves, but this data gets into the archaeological record so that future archaeologists, regardless of the kind of work they're doing, they have one more piece of that puzzle that we can put in. And over time, the more pieces of the puzzle we have, the more complete a picture we know about the past.
So it sounds like the collaborative was not just cobbled together for the purpose of a particular grant project. Do you know, is there a next step for the archaeological part of it?
That's a complicated question. There currently is not a plan for the next round of the projects. And really what happens is they have to take the information in, digest it, think about what's the best way to do things within their individual county and for their own collections. And it really depends county to county.
Well, thanks so much for laying out the collaborative and how it got going, what questions you started with, and as we're finding out, what questions you ended up with.
My pleasure.
And thank you all for joining us for this conversation with Jeremy L. Nienow about the archaeological work Nienow Cultural Consultants did in partnership with the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative. You can find the video presentations of our conversations covering the archaeological work done in each of the Collaborative's 3 counties, and one focusing on the overall project, on the websites for each historical society. We hope you take a chance to view them all and participate the next time there's a public archaeology project in your area.